Welcome to Cybersecurity Luminaries, History and Heroes, a series aimed to highlight the profession's humble beginnings and the men and women who paved the road for all of us. This series is brought to you by Candy Alexander and Cailin Sullivan, your co-hosts from the Cybersecurity Refined and Feral podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cybersecurity Refined and Feral in our very special series that we're calling Cybersecurity Luminaries, Here's History and Heroes. I'm your host, Candy Alexander, and I'm joined, as always, by my brilliant daughter and co-host, Cailin Sullivan.
Hey, everyone. Today we have the distinct honor of welcoming a true legend in the cybersecurity world, and with our special series, the Cybersecurity Luminaries.
That's right, Cailin. Today, we have the immense pleasure of speaking with someone whose work has fundamentally shaped how we approach cybersecurity, not just here in the United States, but globally. He's been instrumental in developing the frameworks and guidelines that so many of us rely on every single day.
So for those of our listeners that might be newer to the field, think of the NIST Cybersecurity Standards, which is a cornerstone for a lot of cybersecurity organizations and businesses in general. Our guest today has been a driving force behind the creation of the cybersecurity standards and their evolution.
So with that, please join us in extending a very warm welcome to the one and only Dr. Ron Ross. Ron, thank you so much for joining us and taking time to explore this conversation. We are truly honored to have you here. Cailin?
We're so excited to delve into your cybersecurity journey, learn about pivotal moments that have defined your career and the profession overall. We're especially excited to hear about how it began for you and the immense impact that your work has had. So welcome.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you, Candy and Cailin, for hosting the show today. Candy, it seems like we've known each other for 50 years. I know it's not that long because you're not that old, but it's been a long time. And I always think about the work that you've been involved in over the years. And I always think about the impact that you've had in our community over the years. And also, it's great to see that you are passing it on to the next generation, having your daughter on the podcast. I love that whole concept, and I'm just happy to be here today. Thanks for inviting me.
A pleasure.
Of course. So let's talk about how you got your start. Like, what initially sparked your interest in the field that would eventually become cybersecurity? Were there any specific events or mentors or even technologies that drew you in?
Well, this is a really interesting story because I literally got into cybersecurity by accident. I spent almost 21 years in the United States Army before I retired, and I got into the field. While I was in the Army, they were sending a group of officers, Army officers, to graduate school to get degrees in computer science, specializing in artificial intelligence and robotics. And so in 1985, I began that journey. I spent almost 4 years at the Naval Postgraduate School. And right before I was to graduate in 1989, and I got a call from the Department of the Army, and they said, the job that we thought you were going to, I was going to be a program manager for the Army's autonomous vehicle program. That's the robots that do the explosive ordnance detection and all the robotic vehicles that you see today routinely. That was back then, and the field was just starting. The technology was very new. Well, anyway, they called me up and said the guy that is currently in that job has decided to extend for 1 year. So he's not leaving. You need to find yourself another job. So I called a couple of friends of mine who worked at the National Security Agency, and I said, do you guys have any openings for computer science people who have degrees in artificial intelligence and robotics? And they said, absolutely, we would love to have you. So that was my first assignment in 1990. I showed up there. I had no security clearance. I had to wait for 3 months to get my top secret SCI clearance. And while I was waiting, they sent me over to NIST and to a company called Trusted Information Systems. Candy, you may remember that company. Uh, I think it was Steve Gallagher that had started it. Not Steve Gallagher, Steve Walker, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
had started that company. So they sent me to those two places for 3 months to kind of start my journey on cybersecurity. I knew nothing about cybersecurity, but thanks to the great people over at NIST and also at TIS, they spent a lot of time with me at the whiteboard and just being very generous with their time. And Chuck Flieger and Steve Walker, and there were a host of people that just sat down with this young guy coming out of grad school who knew nothing, and they spent time. And that's one of the things I've carried through my career, is always trying to mentor and help out the next generation. It's so important. But that's how I got my start in cybersecurity. I showed up at NSA finally after 3 months. I got my clearance. I could go in the building, and of course, I was very intimidated back then because this is the NSA. You hear all the stories and everything. And the same thing happened there. I sat down with some of the best and the brightest minds in cybersecurity. This was in 1990, and the National Computer Security Center. That was Pat Gallagher, and I was in the division that produced the Rainbow series. Now, I know, Candy, I know you remember that, and Cailin, you may or may not remember the Rainbow series, but those were the foundational documents that started the computer security field. The Orange Book was the operating systems, the Red Book, and that whole series of publications. That's the division I landed in. And again, everybody there, I spent countless hours at the whiteboard going over the fundamentals. I read every book that I could on cybersecurity, from Maury Gasser's book to Chuck Flieger's book. And I just was like a sponge, and I loved the field. From the day I got there, I knew this was the place I wanted to be because it had such exciting, challenging problems. It seemed like the whole world was talking about cyber even back then.
Mm-hmm.
And from that time, I never looked back.
So that's what attracted you the most. That's what made you connect right away, is the challenge. And
yes, it was the difficult problems that you could see the technology coming at that point. I mean, that was back in the days before we had smartphones and tablets and all that stuff. It's hard to, we were barely on the internet at that point.
Yeah.
But I could see that this technology was coming like a roller coaster, ahead of us, and it was going to just impact every aspect of society. And you can see over the last 30 or 40 years how computers have gotten more powerful, connectivity more pervasive. And now with cyber physical convergence, where computers are going into everything from pacemakers to power plants, it's impacting not just how we do our business, but it impacts how society works in general. And it's been a phenomenal, just something awesome to watch. And of course, Cailin, your generation, the things that you're going to experience that we might not be able to experience are going to be even tenfold about what we've already seen with artificial intelligence, robotics, and the things that are going to be just becoming kind of a part of our infrastructure and the way society operates. It literally is breathtaking. And that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping young people today who are looking at cybersecurity can look at some of us old codgers and say, well, you did your thing, and now let us have a whack at this new technology and see what we can do with it. And it's for any young person who's willing to invest the time and in the fundamentals, whether it's computing in the STEM area, computer science, computer engineering, mathematics, all of that provides a real grounding in the fundamentals. And that's really the other big thing that I like to convey to young people, is that in your lifetimes, you're going to experience massive amounts of change, many different jobs. It isn't like our generation where we stayed at companies, and I was at NIST for 28 years almost, in the Army for 21. And so when the Army came to me and said, you're not going where you thought you were, I was a little bit intimidated. But the one thing I could rely on is I had a really solid foundation in computer science, computer engineering. And those are the things that I could apply, because cybersecurity builds on top of that solid foundation. So if you have that investment, in your own education early, it's like investing in the stock market or anything that, over time is going to grow. Investing in the fundamentals of your education will absolutely carry you for a long, long way. And it'll also take you through periods of change when, sometimes you can't control when you lose a job or you get a job. Things are just happening. And so you have to rely on those things you can count on. And that's what I did. And it served me well. And I'm hoping it serves, a lot of the young people well as we go forward in time.
Yeah. What I think too is interesting about my generation is I definitely grew up with the internet alongside the internet. So I think millennials have a unique perspective as far as like we grew up in the 90s where like access to the internet and computers weren't like a normal thing
Right.
and then have grown with it. Whereas generations after the millennials, it's always been a part of their lives.
Mhm.
So it's almost like we're a bridge between the newer adopters or new technology generations and the older, where we can be the way to convey the lessons that may have been learned prior to technology being such a huge part of everybody's daily lives.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of mentoring, and I just posted on LinkedIn recently. For the past year, I've been mentoring a young high school student. He's a senior at Mount Hebron High School in Howard County. That's where I lived for 32 years. And they have a gifted and talented research program there. And my wife used to do community theater with the advisor who runs the program. And she said, hey, they're looking for mentors. I said, well, I think I may try this. It's been a great experience. The young man who is a senior at Mount Hebron, we spent the better part of, I think, 6 to 9 months, once or twice a month, mostly twice a month, going through all of the fundamentals of cybersecurity, mostly from the NIST publications.
Mhm.
And it's been an absolute joy to work with. And I really hear a lot of my generation sometimes, not everybody, but they kind of look down at the younger generation. They say, they're not as good as we. Their work is hard. They work ethic. And I found just the opposite. I
Yes.
found the young people are smart, they're inquisitive, and every generation has to deal with what they've been given from the previous generations. I mean, your generation has a lot of issues that are going to be dealt with because that's just the way it is, from one generation to the next.
Mhm.
But I found the young people engaging, respectful of like in the case where the person I was mentoring, just loved to listen to stories, knowledge being passed down. And you see that kind of thing. And then knowing that they're so smart and how they can do critical thinking. That's the most important thing anybody can take away from any college or education. Can you critically think through problems, hard problems? And that's something that takes a lot of work. And I see that in a lot of young people. They're very inquisitive. They just have a thirst for the knowledge. And they're going to have a lot of different tools and technologies available that we didn't have. Like when I was doing my research for my PhD, I had to go to the library and put in a list of topics. And then 4 days later, they'd come back with a stack of books. And if you compare that to modern research, where you can go on to Google or do any kind of search, now you got to be careful because what you're getting has to be authentic, and you got to be kind of. But the fact is that there is knowledge out there everywhere, and our ability to store knowledge now with the amount of the computing storage capacity we have, and AI is going to demand more power from the grid. It's going to demand more storage because all those AI thinking machines are going to be thirsting for more data to inform them and to learn and to grow. So it's a different way to do research, but the fundamentals of the humans are still the same. They're inquisitive. They want to attack challenging problems, giving back to society, trying to make things better than the way we got them. Our generation, Candy, you and I, we want the younger people. We want to leave them a better place, and I think that's kind of what's been driving you for a long, long time.
Absolutely. And I think that's again, there's the future is limitless, right? It always has been, and that's why it's so exciting. But I think as well that is one of the reasons I wanted to do this series is to ensure that the next generation, whatever that is building upon what our legacy we're leaving them. And unfortunately, history is not always appreciated in our culture and society. And so I wanted to capture everyone's story that had a significant role to play in our profession so that they can come back and listen to these transcripts or read them, whatever, where they're going to receive the information. I want to capture that before it's lost, because so many of our dear colleagues and friends and loved ones are already, we're starting to lose them. So that's why, again, it's so incredibly important for this.
Yeah.
I want to bring us back. You had mentioned, your story came about and started with, the department that pulled together the Rainbow books. And so, again, those were the predecessor to the NIST standards. Can you share with us the story of how that transition happened, how we had the Rainbow series, what the intended audience was for, because I think that's important. And then
Right.
how did that transition to the NIST standards, and how did the NIST standards, because we've had this conversation, transpire to be adopted by public entities or private entities, I should say?
Yeah, there's a whole story, a backstory behind how all this happened. I think great credit goes to the folks at NSA in the early days, recognizing they were focused. They're a DoD organization, so they were largely focused on protecting the military systems, and they started out with the focus on confidentiality. Our business traditionally has three pillars: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, the Orange Book was started, and the Rainbow series was started to work with commercial industry. The folks in NSA knew that our systems had to be well protected, and they knew that they wanted to do that with the best technology available. So you go to the private sector, because they're the ones that, nobody's building operating systems in the government or producing hardware or software for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, let's define the best practices, the requirements. The Orange Book had a lot of requirements. They were organized around what we call functionality and assurance requirements. Functionality would be things like access control mechanisms, encryption. Those are the functions that the computer executes to do the protection itself. The assurance requirements were targeted: how was the security function designed? What kind of development process did you go through? Did you go through testing and evaluation to see if that function is actually doing what it's supposed to do? And so the Orange Book, in their, I think it was 6 classes back then, from C1 up to A1, where C1 was the minimum functionality and the minimum assurance, up to class A1, which was formal methods, highly, highly assured and highly functional. And so they specify those requirements in the Orange Book. And then the next step was to get someone to actually build an operating system that could go through an evaluation to ensure those requirements in the Orange Book were being met.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the paradigm. They had the division that I was in was the one producing the requirements in the Rainbow series. And then we had an evaluation division across the hall, and they worked with the FFRDCs like MITRE and Aerospace and IDA, the Institute for Defense Analyses, to develop evaluators who could go and evaluate the products that were being produced by industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had many, many companies that took up the challenge, and they built they were called trusted operating systems. Yeah. And what made them trusted is that the companies would build the product. They would then bring it into the National Security Agency, and they signed non-disclosure agreements. And then the evaluators would actually go through and evaluate the design, the functions. They would go through evaluation and testing regimens that would then, if they were successful, they would get a rating, and that would go on the trusted products evaluations list. And then you could go purchase that product and have some level of assurance that it was meeting those security requirements. Well, that was a great idea.
I actually, sorry to interrupt, but I actually remember at the time I was working at Digital Equipment Corporation. Yeah. And I remember Digital going through that process, and we're all like on pins and needles. Because of course, one of the divisions I worked in was Fax VMS, the hardware, and of course the software division was up in Nashua, New Hampshire, which I'm sure you remember that history. But I remember going through that and wondering where we were going to fall in regards to the classification. So I just wanted to insert. I can attest to that real life nervous biting nail syndrome. Yeah.
There were some there was some great companies back then that produced those
Mhm.
systems. DEC was one of the early adopters of that technology. Well, the problem was sometimes great ideas, if you don't follow through, they can kind of die an unnatural death. So we had the evaluated products list, but then what happens with technology in general, and of course with software it's even worse, is that it evolves over time and they make changes. Well, when you evaluate a product, you lock it down in a certain configuration, and then anytime you modify that product, the question is, did your modifications, is it still a trusted product like it was before? Well, the NSA anticipated that and had what they called a ratings maintenance program. It's called RAMP. And you could bring your product back in with updates and then try to keep up that rating over time, which was a good idea. But the problem is that operating systems are one of the largest pieces of software, most complicated. It took a long time to evaluate. It took a long time to develop. And the worst thing that happened was as products have evolved over time, sometimes they didn't get through the ratings maintenance program in time. And then the customers would call and say, I don't want the previous generation of that OS. I want the latest generation. And it wasn't evaluated. So there was a disconnect in keeping that list up to date. It was expensive. It took a long time. And basically the program, it transitioned from the TPEP at NSA to the NIAP program, the National Information Assurance Partnership, which was a joint partnership with NIST and NSA. And the idea there was to bring it into the commercial world a little bit stronger. And that was also when I was at NSA, just leaving at that point in time. And I retired from the military and I went to work for the Institute for Defense Analyses. But before I left NSA, we worked on a project called the Federal Criteria. And nobody's ever probably heard about that criteria, but that was a transition document that went from the old NSA Orange Book. And the idea was to get us to an international like standard that wasn't focused on the DoD. Well, the Federal Criteria project with NIST, I was at NSA at the time, and my partners were over at NIST. It was Gene Troy, Stu Katsky. We did that project, but it never really got very far because by that time, the common criteria was coming onto the scene. And that was the one that became ISO standard 15408. And that was a true international standard that involved 5 or 6 countries in developing. We had the Canadians, the US was there, the UK, I think France and the Netherlands might have been the 5 original countries. And every country back then had their own criteria. You know, the Europeans had theirs. I can't recall what it was called now, but the Canadians had their own criteria. The problem is every country had their own criteria, and their companies are building to their criteria. Then when they get evaluated, and let's say you were in the US, you want to buy a Canadian product. Well, it's been evaluated by the Canadians. Do I trust that? You know? So the common criteria leveled the playing field. It made one criteria. And again, there was functionality requirements and assurance requirements. But now the world had a common criteria to work from. And we took the next step is we developed the common criteria testing labs. These were evaluation labs. And we worked on the mutual recognition arrangement with the original 5 countries. So anytime a product was built and evaluated in a different country that was part of that testing laboratory scheme that was set up, we would have mutual recognition. So if the Canadians built a product and went through their laboratory, people in the US could buy it with a level of confidence and assurance. And that really pushed global trade. So cybersecurity has the protection aspects, but there's also an aspect of trade and global commerce as well. And you really have to worry about both of those, because if you stovepipe your efforts and your companies are producing great trusted products here, but then people around the world don't have confidence to buy those, then you have a problem. And you know, we for many, many years dominated the production of operating systems and technology. But if you look today, a lot of that capability is being diffused around the world. So now we're kind of on the other end of that. We have to buy products sometimes that were not developed in the United States. And you get the problem, I call it the black box problem. We all buy black boxes, smartphones, tablets, computers, operating systems. Most of us don't have a clue what's going on inside the black box. And that's why that's going to be a huge problem with AI moving forward, because all this artificial intelligence technology and all those the large learning models and all those machine learning programs are developing massive amounts of information that people are going to use to make decisions. How do I know if I can trust that AI application that is producing the right information? And make no mistake about it, these AI applications and technologies are going into everything that matters. Critical infrastructure, power plants, weapon systems. And so this is where artificial intelligence and computer security are kind of come together and meet. And I believe that in order for AI to be successful long term and be really pushing out to the reach the full capabilities, we're going to have to build and maintain more trusted operating systems, trusted systems in general, because otherwise the adversaries are going to use AI to exploit our systems even more than they are now. And we're going to be doing the same thing probably. So we got to solve that problem.
I could not agree with you anymore. Of course, I'd be that a surprise, right? But I speak a lot about my involvement with the Cloud Security Alliance and getting involved in the AI research groups and all of that. And we have some pretty good discussions about, trust and validation, right? And it's interesting. This is, again, one of the reasons why I think these conversations about our roots and our history are absolutely critical. There are many that believe we will get to a point where human in the loop is not necessary. And of course, my response to that is I believe it's going to be dependent on the level of risk or the level of trust. Go back to the conversation you were just mentioning, the criteria in which you have built the Orange Book, right? Such as the functionality and the assurance, those major categories.
Right.
Insert AI. The level of functionality for the AI system or agents or whatever, right? That concept of the functionality, and then to have an assurance, in a way to test that assurance and the level of that assurance. So this is, again, why I'm so excited to do this and have conversations with folks like you to remind us the basics will never change.
That's a great point. And Cailin, for your generation, this is one of the things I noticed from the time I left NSA to the present day. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, so it's not just my opinion. The whole concept of assurance has kind of left the building in many people's minds. Most people focus on functionality. What does the product do? What capabilities does it have? There's not nearly enough focus on assurance, which means how is the product built? What kind of methods were used to develop the software, secure coding techniques, memory-safe programming languages? Many computer programming languages are not the best to develop software because you can do a lot of things with the language itself that are pretty risky. And we tried to, you remember back in the day, the DoD tried to solve that problem by developing a language called Ada, which was a language that was much more strongly typed and didn't allow programmers to do dumb things. I mean, programmers are very creative. Given their druthers, they'll go off the reservation pretty quickly, sometimes for good reasons, for innovation. But assurance is about bringing the receipts. If you tell me that your product does X, Y, and Z, then I need for you to prove it to me. I need to, the concept of trust and trustworthiness is very related to assurance. I had a post on LinkedIn just this week about the term secure and then the term trustworthy secure. And I talked about the term secure is an absolute term it's an absolute concept that cannot be achieved absolutely. And we have a lot of tendency to talk about absolutes like secure by design or zero trust architectures, they're good concepts, but it leads people to a false sense of security. When you're talking about the term security or secure, you really have to have an adjective in front of that called trustworthy, because trustworthy allows you to have a continuum of trust. And sometimes when you're building products and systems in the trade space, you would like to have a perfectly secure or a highly trusted product, but you can't get it because there's not one available. So you might have to choose between two different operating systems. And the size and the complexity of the operating systems and what kind of trust has been built into those products makes a difference. So sometimes I may have to settle for products that are less trustworthy, but at least I do that with my eyes wide open. And when you're talking about the real action in cybersecurity happens, I call it below the waterline. There's above the waterline and below the waterline. Above the waterline is like when you're on the ocean. The sharks and all the bad stuff is below the waterline, and icebergs and all the things that can really do damage. Above the waterline, all you're seeing is calm seas and everything is good.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like looking at a beautiful new automobile, and then you look at the car, you admire it, you walk around the car, and then you pop the hood. What's under the hood? That's where the power, the engine is. And in cybersecurity, everything that happens that we have to be able to trust is in that engine department. You have to pop the hood, and you have to understand how the engine is built, what kind of components make up that engine. And so, Candy remembers the days when you have a trusted operating system, and then it's called the stack. You got the operating system, you have middleware, you have applications on top of that. It all connects out to the network. And so these hundreds and thousands of components, hardware, software, firmware, are all composed into a system with capability. And we have to be able to set the tone for how do I understand how all of those products that come together to give us a capability, how much can I trust them? Mm-hmm. And that's why when you use the term secure by design, you really have to ask the question is, what do you mean by secure by design? Or what do you mean I have a secure product? What do you mean by that? Tell me more. And so this is what I call, we have a desperate need for assurance and being able to make credible risk-based decisions on how trustworthy are the individual components, and then composition when those components are brought together to whatever we're building, whether it's a pacemaker or a power plant. I then can make better decisions on how much I should trust that, especially when it's going into critical systems, critical infrastructure. I mean, there's a big difference between building a pacemaker with wireless access and then just operating your computer system at home, for doing games and things like that. Sometimes where these computers end up, especially now with cyber physical convergence, where everything now is computers aren't everything. Software and firmware are driving the intelligence of those computers, and they're going everywhere into everything. So assurance and trustworthiness is a discussion that we need to have. And I'm hoping that we don't just gloss over and end up settling for the term secure by design without any meaning behind that. And that's Cailin, that's what I started with. That's your generation's challenge, because we've lost at least 2 generations of people who understand what assurance is and why it's important. And we have to get that back, especially if we're going to push AI out to the edge. At some point, if we don't attend to the foundation and the assurance of that foundation, it's going to come back to bite us big time. And it could be in a catastrophic way in the critical infrastructure. Nobody wants to see that.
So there was a movement at one time where when you would go for a degree, it would be in information assurance. And now it seems like now it's, of course, cybersecurity, master of whatever. So I would like to hear your take on that. And then I would also like to hear your take, because it drives me absolutely crazy. It seems like those darn marketers, right? The marketeers, they come in and they start playing with these words, that you've already thrown some around, like zero trust and, security by design, which was also privacy by design. I think that we're too much latching on to catchy phrases and names. What's your take on that, and how do we correct that for Cailin's generation?
Yeah, well, there's 2. So you have 2 questions. Let me do the first one. I'll go back to the curriculum and the degree programs and cybersecurity and all that. But the marketing is always going to be with us. In this country, we have a free, open society. We're a capitalist country. People start businesses. They want to sell products. And so that hype is always going to be there. I've seen generations of hype. I went through the cloud computing thing, and I went through the now we're in the AI type. There's always going to be some hype But then, with cloud and AI and smartphones and things that were on the cutting edge become mainstream at some point. So the hype will die down eventually. You have to be able to sift through the hype versus the reality. That's the first thing. It's always going to be on the responsibility of the customer to be a discerning customer. In other words, we have a responsibility to ask some questions. And a lot of times we don't do that. We're just so enamored with the technology and we get addicted to the technology because why wouldn't you? Who doesn't want to be on that smartphone with 1,000 apps? I'll tell a quick story about that. When you're in computer security, you get a phone, and I had a government phone for a long, long time, and you're not only supposed to download certain apps. So, people who work in the government, we're like everybody else. We see a new cool app out there, and sometimes you want to do it. So one time I was sitting in a movie theater with my wife, Connie. This is back years ago. And somebody said, you can download an app for your phone right now that will tell you the optimal time when you can go to the bathroom, during the movie. They've done all the research. And so I'm looking at that now. At that time, I was probably, almost 60 years old, man, even back then. And I'm saying, so, for someone who's young, maybe in their 20s, that's not a mission essential application. But for me, at my age, that was a mission essential application. I don't want to miss a good part of that movie. So I went ahead and downloaded that. That's the temptation that we have. We all want the application. So the problem is today is that the buyers have to beware. Things that you're downloading, anytime you touch a website, open up an email application, open up an attachment, anytime you touch any part of that internet infrastructure, the sophisticated malicious code can be instantaneously downloaded to your device. And that's something that most people never see. They may not even feel it because the sophisticated actors now are after certain types of information, certain capabilities, targeting, and they have an attack chain that is well honed. And so this is where customers have to start to be discerning customers and ask questions. We can't just settle anymore for every product that comes from the vendor without asking the questions. Well, how did that product get built? What kind of trustworthiness should I put into that product? Now, it's true that you probably can't on an individual basis influence Microsoft or Google, but we need to have the ability as a society to start asking those questions, which maybe will drive the vendors to being more transparent, more visible with how those products are being built. Now, if it's going into my home computer and it's not going to be catastrophic, I mean, the blue screen of death happened a lot. Candy, you probably remember that term. Cailin, maybe not. But nobody died from the blue screen of death that I know of. But today, the blue screen of death can have catastrophic consequences because of cyber physical convergence and where those computers are going. So this is a conversation that is going to take place between consumers and producers. And the government may or may not get involved. Sometimes the government gets involved and regulates, but we don't like to regulate too much because it sometimes impinges on innovation. Mm-hmm. And so there's that delicate balance that has to be struck. We're not there now. I know that because there's a lot of black boxes out there that I don't know a lot about, and the vendors industry is not providing enough information. That's what's driving the SBOM work, the security bill of materials, the software bill of materials. We're trying to get industry to give us more information. What kind of processes did you use to build that software? What kind of testing and evaluation did you go through? Are you fixing your vulnerabilities or the weaknesses and deficiencies? And then of course on our end, we have to be more vigilant at patching and doing things to keep the software up to date. That's the long answer to your first question. The second question about degrees, this is another frustration of mine. When I was at NSA, we used to hire young people to come in to work at the agency. And the first thing you do when you interview them, what kind of a degree do you have? And the second question is, what kind of courses did you take within that degree program? And I found that computer science programs and computer science programs with a focus on computer security, those didn't exist in the early days, by the way. They're very different. And I'll give you one example. When I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, one of the courses that was required is something called automata theory. Now, you might not have ever heard of that, but it basically is a course. It's the mathematics of computer science. It talks about complexity theory, what kinds of things are possible in a world of computers and computing, Turing machines, finite state machines. That course was very, very important to the fundamental understanding of how computers work, but there wasn't much call for it after graduation unless you were working in kind of a theoretical job or something in an R&D area. So a lot of times the courses disappeared from the curriculum because colleges and universities are under a lot of pressure to have courses that are relevant and then can transfer to when the student graduates, you can go out and get a job where you know something and you can do something constructive. So there's a tension. There's only so many hours and so many classes that you can shove into a 4-year program. So when the NSA started their Cybersecurity Center of Excellence project, they worked with colleges and universities. And the way you have to work it is if you could get computer security programs into the curriculum, great. But a lot of times that wasn't possible. So you either had to offer a master's degree program, which takes a computer science undergrad, and then go into a master's program, which kind of builds on that foundation. Or you can take current courses and you can inject new things into that particular course. Like if you're taking a network course or an operating systems course, you can inject parts to that course where they would start to touch on aspects that relate to computer security. The good news is that most work in computer science is foundational to protecting systems. So when you do good software development, what happens in most systems is software is a sloppy process because you're not using formal methods in most cases. Programmers are creative, they're innovative, and they want to get stuff done quickly. A lot of times documentation doesn't get done, and you may want to use programming languages like C or C++. I guess C++ is maybe better, C or C++, but now you're using whatever language the developers want to use. You're importing code libraries, and sometimes the software is a little sloppy, and there's weaknesses and deficiencies that are not caught. Well, you get to buy those as a commercial product, and then you get to enjoy that weakness and deficiencies, which every Tuesday they come out with their Patch Tuesday, and then they ask you to fix all the stuff that they didn't want to fix when they built the product. That story continues today. And so the colleges and universities are all unique to their own curriculums, and of course they're accredited and all that, but there's going to be a continuing need to look at those curriculums, especially for systems security engineering, which is now something we're pushing that takes the engineering, computer engineering and computer science, and then there's a special skill set that can come out of there. There's knowledge, skills, and abilities in the systems security engineering world that kind of have a foot in the computer science world, but also in the engineering world. And those are going to be the people that are very valuable because they'll be part of a team of people that are building software, firmware, hardware, and bringing those capabilities together to offer a product to a customer. So with complexity and with the explosion of the technology that we're seeing, trillions of lines of code, billions of devices, the number of weaknesses and deficiencies that end up becoming vulnerabilities that we know about is exploding. But the more dangerous part of that, and AI may help some of this, but it also may exacerbate the bad guys' ability to get in, is what we call the 0 days. That's the hundreds and thousands of weaknesses and deficiencies that you don't know about that the adversary stumbles across, and they exploit those before there's any patch or and then it becomes a known vulnerability after it's become a 0 day. So that's the nightmare scenario of having complex systems, and complexity is still our number one threat to our technology and moving forward. So yeah.
And isn't it terrifying about what our future is, right? So talk about complexity, just say the words artificial intelligence, and now that artificial intelligence is being used to develop programs, and you're taking bits and pieces of libraries here and there and tossing it to AI to generate even more code. I mean, that's complexity at its utmost. And when we look at the future, so let's shift a little bit more. How can we take the lessons that we've left behind, or that we have experienced, I should say, because I don't think we left them, but how do we take those lessons that we've experienced and reformat them or reintroduce them into our future with AI. Because again, the most profound part of our conversation to this point for me has been that whole reminder of functionality versus assurance, and how those need to happen hand in hand. But the complexity aspect that you just mentioned is now going to be exponentially more.
Yeah, there's two aspects of this that you just touched upon. One is taking what we learned in the past. We have almost 45 or 50 years of what I call fundamentals of computer science, computer security, going back to I guess it was 1976 when the Anderson report, 72, I think, 76. Been a long time. We have to continue to push those foundational principles and concepts forward in time. And that's what we tried to do with our NIST Special Pub 800-160, Volume 1, capturing those 40 years of design principles and concepts of building trusted systems and bringing those forward in time. That's the first thing we have to do. We got to keep that conversation in the forefront of everybody that's working in the business today. And I don't just mean cybersecurity people. I'm talking about people who are building systems, software, because they may or may not appreciate the importance of protecting that software. They hear about it all the time, but they may not appreciate what has to be done below the waterline to really protect that software, where if it's going into a critical system, like a pacemaker or a power plant, we have a level of assurance that we need for society's purposes so we don't have catastrophic occurrences. But the other thing I think we have to do, and this kind of gets to a project that I was working on before I announced my retirement from NIST a couple of months ago. I was working with NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, part of Caltech, on integrating security into our space systems that are being built. And what this talks about the problem that system engineers have in actually building security into those cyber physical systems. If you think about most of our work in the first 40 years of cybersecurity, it was mostly on enterprise level systems, the business systems and things like that. And Candy, you remember all that, even going back to your days, in the early days. It was all the NIST frameworks, the cybersecurity framework, the risk management framework, even though you could apply those to cyber physical systems, it was mostly a kind of a higher level view with the enterprise systems, commercial products, and all of that. The vendors did all the heavy lifting below the waterline. They were the ones producing the hardware, the software, the firmware. Now we get to the point where NASA and the DoD and maybe DOE are building real systems. And they're seeing this massive convergence of cyber and physical systems. You take a satellite system like the one I was working on with NASA and JPL. It's called the Sunrise system. It was 6 CubeSats, 6 satellite cubes that are being launched. It hasn't launched yet. It's been built. It's going to measure the radiation coming off the sun. But you could apply that to any NASA project, going back to the shuttle, SpaceX today, all those space flights going on. So the system engineers are building the components and the satellite and the launch systems. And they have a ground data system which communicates with that satellite or that shuttle or whatever the SpaceX capsule might be. These are system engineers who know, in many cases, they're fantastic engineers. They don't know a lot about cybersecurity. So you bring in the cybersecurity people who are used to using the risk management framework or the cybersecurity framework, and they say, I don't know a lot about engineering. So you can see we have a blending of skills now that are coming in, and there's kind of a gap in knowledge in one group that knows enough about either side to do meaningful work. Well, what we're finding is that space is a very valuable target today, and the adversaries know that, and they're crawling throughout our infrastructure right now. We know that because Rob Joyce had a recent congressional testimony. He talked about the adversaries attacking our critical infrastructure. And what I always tell people is just because the lights are on today doesn't mean that the adversary is not pre-positioned malicious code, because sometimes we're more valuable to an adversary with the lights on than the lights off. You think that with some of the adversaries that we're up against. Some of those adversaries have a lot of our debt. We have big trading partners with them. And they may not want to shut those lights off right now, but knowing that that code has been pre-positioned, they can trigger that attack at a time of their choosing. That's the part that is very unsettling. And we have to fix that problem, because now, whether it's a crane that is unloading goods at a port that's produced by someone other than a company in our country that has lots of cyber physical components on that crane in the port loading stuff, that's another potential target for malicious code that could destabilize our supply chain back end. So the warfighters, for example, that warfighter supply chain goes from the pointy edge of the spear, wherever they're engaging, all the way back to the United States. And the difference in today's war fighting versus back 30, 40 years ago when it was all kinetic, now you can win a war by not firing a shot, by just down critical parts of the infrastructure in that supply chain. That's why the DoD is very concerned about that. So with NASA, they're experiencing the same engagement with adversaries. And without going into any details, what we've learned is that when you put in typical security safeguards, we might call those security controls. Maybe many of those come out of 853, the NIST publications. Maybe they come out of ISO 27001. But typically those controls are selected and they appear in commercial products. But the adversary, the clever ones, have found ways around those safeguards. So what they see is that they put the safeguards in traditional places, and then they can see the adversary now has found ways in the attack sequence to go around those. So now the next generation of what we call cybersecurity, I believe, has 3 dimensions to it. And I talk about this in our NIST publications, and now we're talking about this more with the new Dartmouth project that I'm working on in the Trusted System Security Engineering project. First level is penetration resistance. Stop the bad guys at the front door if you can. And that's what we would say that the last 30 or 40 years has been about penetration resistance, building that moat as high as you can build it, access control. That's what the zero trust movement's all about. Strong authentication, strong access controls, continuous monitoring. But what happens when the bad guys get by that first level of defense? There's a concept we call defense in depth. The second dimension, what I'm calling, is damage limitation. Once they get in your house, and I use an analogy of, you have a house, you have a lock on your front door, but what happens when the bad guys bust through the front door? Well, they can go through every room of your house and steal all your stuff, but what if you have a vault or a safe in every room of your house? Now they've got to go through that vault and that safe. What does that do? It increases their work factor, and they may get tired and go on to the next vault, and they may not get into anything. So once adversaries are in the house, you've got to be able to constrain their lateral movement. And so you got to slow them down. And we have lots and lots of ways to do that with segmentation, virtualization, micro-virtualization, micro-segmentation. You basically make their life miserable. If you're in my house and you're not invited, then I'm going to make your journey here just awful. And so that's the second dimension. We call that damage limitation. Third dimension is called cyber and system resilience. That's being able to take the punch and get back up and continue. Even if you're in a degraded or debilitated state, you keep the lights on, you keep the warfighting capability moving forward, even if you're not at 100%. You're at some operational level. That resilience is kind of like the human body. We have viruses and bacteria out there every day. Our bodies do a tremendous job about fighting those off. Now, occasionally, you can have cancer cells that kind of challenge your immune system, and sometimes you don't win that fight. But we're getting better at that. And so all of the genetic engineering going on now, the cancer research, targeting those cancer cells, the immunotherapy, that's a good analogy for how our defenses are going to evolve with our computing systems over time. And so that's the 3 dimensions that we talk about in the future of trustworthy system security engineering, leading to I would say, a capability that provides resilience to the organization, the enterprise. And again, getting back to our notion of trustworthiness, how much resilience do I have? And that's going to be highly trustworthy levels of resilience, and then resilience that's not quite there. And that's okay, because you can't afford to have perfect protection for everything on the planet, but you do want to have that protection where it's needed for those things that are critical, um, critical systems, critical programs, critical infrastructure, life-threatening things that we all know where those things are. We just haven't really been able to characterize what that vision looks like. And that's been my greatest frustration. You don't hear a lot of talk about engineering, system secure engineering. It's all about secure by design. But then again, what does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean
Right.
patch Tuesday, or you get the idea?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know that's definitely one of the chords that you ring true. And I think that is missed. It's missed a lot. Two more questions. First one. So you've announced your retirement from NIST, and again, thank you so much. I mean, your service and contributions in that role have been, profound is an understatement. But what's next for you? Would you like to talk about that for a moment?
Well, I had a wonderful experience at NIST. In fact, all the pieces of my career have all been great. Um, NIST is a great organization, and they had wonderful people. And I was there at a time when we were able to do some really good things. It was just an opportunity with FISMA and all the
Mhm.
publications that came out. And it's part of the passion. I think that one of the things that I hope every young person who's listening to this, or even some of the older people who still want to ignite that passion, find something that you love to do, and it'll never really be work. And even to the last day at NIST, every morning when I get up, I was excited about what was on the agenda for today. And that excitement and passion when you retire, and this is a message to the people who are retired. Some people go into retirement, they're just glad to be there. They're not looking back. They'll be on the beach drinking margaritas, whatever. But to me, if you still have the passion and there's still the challenges out there and the need, then I wanted to be able to continue to contribute. And I've got a couple of things that I'm working on. One, I just recently started a position at Dartmouth College as a fellow there. I'll be working with my friend Sammy Sagery, who I've known for a long, long time, going back to our NSA days. And we're going to be working on something I talked about earlier called the Trustworthy Secure Systems Engineering Project. We're basically going to try to define an ecosystem that has 6 pillars in it. And it goes from, I won't go into a lot of the details. It'll be on, I think I posted on LinkedIn. There's a short paper you can read. But it brings together people, part of the problem, processes, and technology. All 3 components have to come together in the ecosystem to promote innovation, new technology, making sure that what we produce is trustworthy, and then making sure we have this knowledge, skills, and abilities from the younger generation to continue this journey and becoming the best that we can possibly be. So that's one of my passions. I'll be working with the great team at Dartmouth College and their Institute for Security, Technology, and Society. And the other thing
Mhm.
I just launched last week was my own small company. It's a company of one. It's me, sole proprietor. It's an LLC. It's called Ron Ross Secure, and it's just going to be more of an advisory services company. There's a lot of people out there who need, a step up, just some quick conversations, and I'll be maybe some board of director type work. But I'm just loving the things that are on the horizon. And your runway gets shorter as you get older, but that doesn't mean that what runway is left can't be the most meaningful part of your life. And that's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm just again excited. And thanks again for spending the time today and hearing my side of the story.
Absolutely. I am just so thrilled to hear you say that because you do have so much more knowledge to share with so many more people. So I'm so excited to hear you're continuing your journey. And by the way, when you get up to Dartmouth, if you go on site, let me know. And if it's in the summertime, we'll have to get together because that's
Absolutely.
where,
That's a done deal. Yep, for
yeah,
sure.
we'll even drag Cailin with us and she can pay the bill. um, the other question, as you might have heard from our previous recordings with Gene Spafford, um, again, there's so many that I have feared we've lost their voice and or recognizing those individuals. So I believe we have a couple that I would like to ask you about. One I know we both had known quite well. Love to get your first reactions, what your thoughts are when you hear this name, and that
Okay.
name is Howard Schmidt.
Howard Schmidt, a wonderful, wonderful individual. I met and became friends with Howard over the years. He worked at the White House for a time, as you know, and just a very innovative, visionary type of person. Very, you can judge people on their technical, their street creds, but the kind of individual they are, the person they are, their character. He was class act all the way, and he is missed greatly. And it's a shame that we lose people sooner than we would like to. And but yeah, number one, he's just the top of the list.
Yeah, absolutely. The other one I believe you're going to know, and if not, that's okay because I mean we were so spread out in the early days, and that was Don Parker. Would you
Don
know?
Parker, I know him less well than Howard, but Don again is a luminary.
Yeah.
We've had numerous conversations over the years, exchanged lots of emails, and he again really was kind of the foundational, kind of one of the founding fathers, I would consider. They were some of the folks that did the initial hard thinking about the problem and even getting the whole field started. And I always thought of Don and all the work he did out at Stanford, and I think it was SRI, that he was kind of one of those founding fathers that, again, the contributions are enormous. They're hard to measure, but, keeping his work, Howard's work alive and pushing it forward is going to be really important. That's why I was so enthusiastic about the series that you and Cailin are doing. There's one other name out there that I know Candy, that this was kind of a classic battle over the years. People, Alan Paller, who
Yes.
was around for years, and he had the SANS Institute. Now, for years, Alan and I had we were going at each other, and people thought we didn't like each other. We had this great debate and arguing, and we had debates on the stage in public. But over the years, I still have enormous respect for Alan. Again, he was one that was taken from us way too early. Just a very quick story how all of it came together. One time, I've had two bouts with prostate cancer. I had 2003. I had surgery, and then it came back in 2010. And I went into the Johns Hopkins program that was we were talking about immunotherapy and how they had that innovative research. And I discovered when I was at Johns Hopkins that Alan's daughter, I think her name is Channing Paller, was a world-renowned prostate cancer researcher.
Oh wow.
So I reached out to Alan and said, "Hey, I was up at Johns Hopkins and I ran across your daughter that's doing all this. You must be very proud of her." And he wrote back a very nice email and said, "Well, I hope you weren't there for the wrong reasons." And but I said, "Yeah, unfortunately, I was there for the right reasons." And he said, "Well, I'm really sorry to hear about your situation." And but we established that was a bonding point at that point. And from that time, we were always kind of friends, but we kind of cemented our friendship. And it's just on a human level. Sometimes we have these big debates and discussions, and it's good to have the challenging back and forth discussions. But at the end of the day, as Alan and I always talked about, we were always on the same team. We were trying to achieve the same things. And this is still true today. There's a lot of people in our business who have different ideas about how to get from point A to point B. But the important thing from my perspective is to be respectful, to respect them as individuals and their ideas, and don't have the not invented here syndrome. Always be open to willing to learn new ideas, and that kind of collaboration. I go back to the President Kennedy's great speech about going to the moon and doing other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That speech in 1961, I believe, 8 years later, we landed our first astronaut on the moon, our first man on the moon. And that was the greatest example of what I call the essential partnership. Government, industry, and academia collaborating to solve what seems to be the impossible problems, the difficult and challenging problems. That concept is still true today. We have great people in government, industry, and the academic community not just here in this country, but around the world, we have great challenges. And it's that kind of mindset, I think, that'll bring us together, keep us moving forward, and allow us to do great things that I've seen in my lifetime, and Cailin will see even more in her lifetime. And it's just great to be able to hopefully be able to see that happen.
Yeah. I definitely agree with the debating thing. I've told my coworkers and my manager at work, the day I stop arguing with you or debating with you is the day you need to start worrying about me.
Very true.
Well, thank you so much. I can't say enough how enlightening and how much of a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Walking down memory lane, and I mean, I hadn't thought about digital going through that criteria, and a lot. I mean, ages and ages, right back to tying the conversation from our lessons learned into today's, exploration and adoption of AI, and how we need to be really careful and ensure there are assurances in place. So again, can't thank you enough. It was absolutely wonderful to see you again. And I do hope, like we say when we get older, we never get a chance to really sit and enjoy each other's company and conversation enough. So hopefully, we'll have that opportunity again in the future. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close. So again, my most sincere appreciation and gratification for everything you've done, not just today's conversation.
Thanks, Candy. Thank you very much. And thanks, Cailin. I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Of course. Yes. Thank you so much for, spending this time with us. It's
glad to do it.
Your knowledge is so valuable. So.
Yes. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close out our episode for today. We hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it as much as we. If you have any comments, feedback, we would love to have them in the comments section below. And as always, until next time, stay secure, stay refined.
And don't be afraid to get a little bit feral.
Thank you.